James Franklin fired at Penn State. So who could be next? We'll react to all of it here on Overtime with Matt Moscona. Thanks so much for finding the channel. I'm Matt Moscona. I'm the host of After Further Review on ESPN radio affiliates throughout Louisiana. Also, the host of the Locked on LSU podcast and the publisher at louisianasports.net. So thank you so much for being here with us. The news came on Sunday after Penn State lost to Northwestern, its third consecutive loss, that the Nittany Lions were firing James Franklin in his 12th season there at Happy Valley. The biggest surprise here has to be the timing. Now, I'm going to get into candidates and who I think might make sense. And I know there's some watching who will be interested that Brian Kelly's name is floating, and I'll address that coming up in a little bit. But the surprising part of this with Franklin is more so the timing and the amount of the buyout in the rev share era. Listen, Franklin was in his 12th season, and sometimes things run their course. Listen, in covering LSU, I can tell you there was a similar feeling with Les Miles, who took the job at LSU in 2005 and had great success. He won a national championship. He played for another. He won a couple of SEC titles, played for a third. He had a Nick Saban problem where he couldn't get over the hump. They lost 8 straight to Alabama. And ultimately, you had an athletic director that didn't hire him, that was looking for the opportunity to move on. And after a couple of early season losses in 2016, Joe Oliva made the decision to fire Les Miles. You have a similar situation here, it feels like, at Penn State, where you have an athletic director that was looking to move on because Franklin, despite all of his successes and his many wins in 12 seasons or 11 plus seasons at Penn State, James Franklin was 104 and 45, 104 and 45. He was 64 and 36 in the league, but the numbers everybody talks about, he was 1 and 15 against the top 5 and 4 and 21 against the top 10. He just couldn't, he won games, he just couldn't win the big games. But even still, 2025 was supposed to be a breakthrough year for James Franklin and Penn State. A season ago, they made the 12-team college football playoff, advanced all the way to the national semifinal where they lost to Notre Dame. They were right there on the brink. And of course, they get Drew Aller back. They go make a play and a change at defensive coordinator. And it's this feeling like this could be Penn State's year. They come into the season, preseason number 2 behind Texas. They have 3 layups to start the season, and they blow out Nevada, FIU, and Villanova. But you could say it was fool's gold, but then they're hosting number 6 Oregon in a whiteout, and they end up losing in overtime. And I can't help but think, what if Penn State had a lead, Oregon had a 4th down play? What if Penn State comes up with that 4th down stop? There's a top 10 win. Penn State's maybe the number 1 team in the country right now. They're certainly motivated going to the West Coast to play UCLA. Hard to imagine a loss there with so much on the line. But you lose that game to Oregon in dramatic fashion in overtime the way you did. Then you got to travel 3 time zones to the West Coast to play in front of, 10,000 people at the Rose Bowl. UCLA had just fired their coach. They gave a great effort. The quintessential example of 18, 19, and 20-year-olds behaving like 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. You're from the East Coast, tough loss. Now you have to fly across the country to play a bad team where you're told you're a big favorite, and you lay down and you get smacked. That can happen. The inexcusable loss clearly was coming back home as a 3-touchdown favorite against Northwestern and losing again. Still, the timing is surprising because it would stand to reason you could play out this season with Franklin and make your decision at the end of the year to move on if you want. Now, there is an advantage of firing a coach now. When you fire a coach midseason, it gives you a head start because now your athletic director can start to have conversations, very open conversations with representatives of coaches you might be interested in speaking with. It allows you to get ahead of the hiring cycle because you never know who come November or December might also be looking for a job. At this point, your athletic director, your search committee can go vet all candidates. So firing a coach before the end of the season sometimes does have an advantage. It also helps with recruiting and portal instances where you don't have maybe this massive turnover the first week in December, last week in November, when your coach is fired there. And so then a new coach has to be quickly hired and then assess what you have with your roster. Remember, also now you have this compressed time period with no spring transfer portal window. You have your December high school signing date, and then that transfer portal, 1 transfer portal window is going to now be at the beginning of January. So all of this time frame is compressed and probably affected a decision like this that Penn State made to move on from not necessarily to move on from Franklin, to move on from Franklin right now. The other part of this is the financial component, where James Franklin has $56 million coming into the season, $56 million left on his contract that pays out through 2031. So you're talking about 6 more seasons after this. Now, it'll be less the amount he's already been paid this year. So it's going to be in the neighborhood of $50 million that they'll owe him for the 26, 7, 8, 9, 30, and 31 seasons over the next 6 years. One of the things worth considering when we look at that dollar amount, which is a big dollar amount, $50 million that Penn State's going to have to pay James Franklin, is when you start to prorate that over 6 years, that's still a giant number. You're still going to be paying a coach some $50 million for 6 years not to coach your team. But it's a lot different if you had to come up with $50 million today to write a check and hand over than if you're prorating that amount over 6 years. You can at least budget for it. The real challenge comes in the fact that this is the revenue share era. For context, in the last fiscal year, for fiscal year 23-24, we don't yet have all the numbers for 24-25 yet. But so in the fiscal year 23-24, Penn State Athletics did $220 million in revenue, and they had $215 million in expenses. So they operated a surplus of about $5 million, but it's virtually break even. I mean, there's this perception people have often that athletic departments make money hands over fist. They generate revenue hand over fist. But generally speaking, whatever comes in goes out. Whatever they make, they spend. They spend on coaches' salaries and facilities and recruiting budgets and everything to be competitive in all sports. So again, Penn State generated $220 million in revenue, and they spent $215 million. So it's not like you have this giant surplus sitting around. And remember, that's before the revenue share era. The revenue share era comes in, and now you've added a $20.5 million line item in your budget where you're now sharing this revenue with the players. So your expenses went from 215. If nothing else changes, your expenses go from 215 to 225, and all of a sudden now you're in the hole, right? So I'm sorry, from 215 to 235, right? Your expenses go from 215 to 235. So now you're in the hole $15 million if nothing else changes, right? And now you're going to add this giant expense of James Franklin's buyout, which will likely be paid by booster dollars and not necessarily athletic department revenue. But how much of revenue do you count as fundraising and different things? I don't know the ins and outs and every line item of the Penn State budget, but suffice to say that it's sticky, right? It's a sticky situation where you just took on a $20 million expense with revenue share, and now you're taking on a $50 million expense over the next 6 years. Plus, you have to pay a new coach. Listen, ultimately, athletic directors have to do what they have to do to win at the highest level. And Penn State got to the point where they realized they had reached their ceiling with James Franklin. They felt like they were not going to break through. It's a pivotal moment right now in an expanded Big Ten where you have to go and be competitive on a national level. And even though they were in the playoff a year ago, you bring back Drew Aller. He's now lost for the season, unfortunately. He's going to be gone after this year. So you're going to have massive turnover there, and it's natural to think both the running backs who returned off of last year's team will be gone. It's natural to assume you're going to have a step back next season, even if you had Franklin. So it's a good time to start over. I get all that. It's the other things that make it complicated, largely the financial decision and the timing as well. And then who are you going to hire? So that tends to be the next most important question that people ask. Okay, you fired James Franklin. Well, who's next in line? Sometimes in covering college football for 20 years, I've learned, obviously, with coaching searches, number one, believe nothing but consider everything. And sometimes the most obvious name is an obvious name for a reason. So one of the first names people are going to throw out is Matt Rhule. And Matt Rhule, who's currently the coach at Nebraska, is an obvious candidate because Matt Rhule played at Penn State. Athletic director Pat Kraft is very close with Matt Rhule as well. So you're talking about a guy in Matt Rhule Matt Rhule took on arguably two of the most difficult jobs in college football, in winning at Temple and at Baylor. Now, it is fair to mention, look, Temple historically, I'd throw Rutgers in there with being the worst jobs in college football. But Matt Rhule at Temple in 4 years went 2-10, then 6-6, then 10-4, then 10-3. And then he went after that, went to Baylor, and he took over a Baylor situation amid scandal. Remember, because you had Art Briles there who had won at a high level, but then amid scandal, the bottom fell out. He goes to Baylor and goes 1-11 in his first year. And after going 1-11 in his first year, then he goes 7-6, then 11-3. He is a turnaround artist at really bad situations, and he's trying to do the same thing now at Nebraska. First season at Nebraska, he was 5-7. A year ago, he went 7-6. As of right now, he's got Nebraska at 5-1, looking like they will build upon what they built now entering year 3. Now, will Matt Rhule view Nebraska and Penn State differently? Probably, because number one, Nebraska is his alma mater, and number two, Pennsylvania is a talent-rich state. It's one of the things that can't be forgotten. Is not look, both Nebraska and Penn State are both in the Big Ten, but Pennsylvania is one of the most talent-rich, fertile recruiting states in the country, along with certainly Ohio and Florida and Georgia and Louisiana and Texas and California. When you talk about the most talent-rich states, Pennsylvania is right there. They have the population base, and a lot of people are just rabid about Penn State football. So it's in theory easier to recruit to Penn State than it is in the Midwest to Nebraska, where you don't have a lot of in-state talent. And Nebraska faces the same challenge that historical programs like Tennessee sometimes face when you're not in a talent-rich state, and a lot of the advantage of the historical success you've had has been neutralized by the fact that everyone's on TV now and everyone can spend money. Nebraska is spending, they are investing. Their boosters want to be great, so they're like Dylan Raiola. They're spending in the transfer portal and in NIL to try to buy their way back to relevance, the way that places like SMU and Texas Tech have. But it's fair to ask, is there a lower ceiling at Nebraska? Certainly a lower ceiling at Nebraska than there is at Penn State. So there's an obvious reason why the allure of going home would be attractive to Matt Rhule. Curt Cignetti is the other name that a lot of people are going to mention. And it's hard to argue against what Curt Cignetti has done. He was at James Madison, had a fantastic run there at JMU. He takes the job at Indiana, and ultimately, very quickly turns around Indiana, another one of the worst college coaching jobs in the sport. And in his first year at Indiana, gets Indiana into the playoff, goes 11-2. They lose in the first round of the playoff. We can have all the conversation that we want about whether or not Indiana should have been in the playoff a season ago. And I am totally open to that conversation. They played one ranked team. They got blown out by that ranked team. They make the playoff anyway at 11-1. They get in the playoff and they get blown out by Notre Dame. So I can understand that. But it's also undeniable that coming into this season now, we've seen Indiana take on two significant ranked opponents. They scored 63 on Illinois, and then they just went on the road and beat Oregon with College game day there and everything. So what Curt Cignetti has done has been nothing short of amazing. It would make far more sense for Cignetti to leave Indiana for Penn State than for Matt Rhule to leave Nebraska for Penn State, except for the emotional ties there. The question is, does Curt Cignetti want to stay put? Does he feel like he can win at the highest level at Indiana? And you're certainly going to have more buy-in, more resources, more fans, more tradition, more booster money, more everything at Penn State than you would have at Indiana. And that would make a lot of sense. There's two SEC names that you're seeing pop up a little bit. One is Lane Kiffin. The other is Brian Kelly. I don't know that Kiffin, who has signed an extension at Ole Miss, is eager to leave Ole Miss. But that was not the case 4 years ago. When Lane Kiffin was at Ole Miss and both the LSU and Florida jobs came open, Kiffin desperately wanted to be considered for those jobs and did not get an interview for either. And word spread throughout the agent world that he was ticked off, that he got no consideration for those jobs. Now, he is stabilized and got an investment there at Ole Miss. But again, you're talking about in an SEC state where there's two SEC schools. You're bracketed by LSU, Auburn, and Alabama, who always try to pillage talent out of Mississippi. And then you're also one of the lowest revenue-producing schools in the SEC, along with Mississippi State. So when you don't necessarily have the resources of elite-level programs, it's fair to ask, is there a lower ceiling at Ole Miss? maybe, and that could make Penn State intriguing. It's not the salary. I mean, Lane Kiffin's going to make $8-10 million a year no matter where he is, and it's warranted. I mean, he's won double-digit games. He's elevated the floor at Ole Miss undeniably, but can he win a championship at Ole Miss is the question that he would have to answer. The Brian Kelly question is one that I understand people are going to bring up because there was an SI piece where someone, a reporter at SI or a columnist, mentioned Brian Kelly as a candidate. Brian Kelly's 63 years old. He has said that LSU is going to be his last stop. And quite honestly, I believe him. I think Brian Kelly is more likely to retire and take a TV job like Nick Saban did than he is to leave LSU to start over at a new program. I think when you look at the move Brian Kelly made 4 years ago when he came to LSU from Notre Dame, he could have finished his career at Notre Dame. He had been there for a decade. He's the winningest coach in the history of that program. But I think he also looked at Notre Dame and the self-imposed challenges that Notre Dame has, in particular with the academic side, that makes it more difficult to build a roster 1 to 85 that could compete with the likes of Alabama and Clemson and LSU, like you saw consistently when Notre Dame would get into those championship level games and then run up against an LSU, a Clemson, an Alabama, and would lose handily because they just didn't have rosters that could compete 1 to 85 against those teams. Well, it's why he came to LSU, because he watched the three previous coaches win championships. You can do that. You can build that roster at LSU. Now, it hasn't happened to this point. We'll see what happens moving forward. But Brian Kelly's also been very adamant that, he sort of said it tongue in cheek, but with this new rev share era and having a GM involved, that's why he never went to the NFL, because he didn't want this component of the job. It's why he was in college. He wanted to recruit and develop players. Well, a lot of that has gone by the wayside. So the question I think Brian Kelly has to answer more than likely is, could Brian Kelly potentially leave? It's hard to imagine him going to start over again at a new place, but would he stay at LSU trying to win a national championship, which is the one box he has not checked in his career, is a national champion. He's checked every other box, winning his active coach in college football. He's been to the BCS championship. He's been to the 14 playoff. He's been to, he's won at every level he was at, but he hasn't won the national championship. So does he stay at LSU, continuing to build and try to win that evasive national championship? Or does he say, you know what, I've made a lot of money. I'll go make 7 figures a year doing TV, where I still get to be around the game. I still get to talk sports. I still get to travel, still get to be in stadiums, but I don't have to game plan or recruit or worry about fundraising or NIL or revenue share or any of that stuff. And that may be more appealing for Brian Kelly now, approaching his mid-60s, than another reset button at a new program. I think, again, I'm not making a prediction that Brian Kelly's leaving. I'm just saying it would be more likely that he would leave and go do TV than leave LSU for another coaching job. A couple of other names worth mentioning is guys who have had power jobs before that are rebuilding themselves. Dan Mullen is an obvious one. He had been at Mississippi State, had been at Florida, did TV for 3 seasons, now is back at UNLV and has them as a contender for the group of 6 college football playoff opportunity. And again, Dan Mullen is a Northeastern guy, so it would fit maybe more with Dan Mullen going back to the Northeast. And he's a great offensive schemer and game planner and play caller. That's always undeniable. I mean, he won at a level that was unprecedented at Mississippi State. And he had won at Florida, just not at the rate Florida wanted him to win. And then Manny Diaz is another that some are mentioning. Manny Diaz has ties to Penn State. He had been the defensive coordinator at Penn State in 2022. So, from 22 and 23. So there's a little bit of a tie there that he knows. He knows the fan base. He knows the football program, the recruiting base, sort of the lay of the land there. He's game planned against a lot of these Big Ten coaches that currently exist in the Big Ten. So there's familiarity. And Diaz right now is the head coach at Duke. So that's one worth mentioning as well as you start to file away some of those. You could always look at the G6 taking the big opportunity, like a John Summerall at Tulane, who's a name's going to come in for, who's a name that's going to come up in all of these jobs that come available. But sometimes the most obvious name is the most obvious name for a reason. And Matt Rhule, Curt Cignetti are pretty obvious reasons, and ones that will probably be at the top of Penn State's list. But it's one of the premier jobs in college football. It's now open, and it will likely dictate what a lot of other schools do. And remember, you could make your way through a season where you already have, Virginia Tech open, Arkansas open, UCLA is open, Oregon State is now open as well. And you'll see more jobs come available. What about those top 5, 10, 15 jobs in the country? Penn State certainly is one of those. Could Florida come open if Billy Napier struggles throughout the remainder of the season? Something worth keeping an eye on, and why it was probably important for Penn State to act now, even though it's going to cost them $50 million to pay James Franklin from now through 2031. Let me know your thoughts on who Penn State should hire. You can drop your comments below. We appreciate you for being with us. Hey, if you are new, please smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and don't be a stranger here on Overtime with Matt Moscona.